getting just quiet and still and nothing going on. That's my life. That's not a description of what I try to cultivate. It's not a description. All right, good morning. Good morning. Glad to see everyone here. If you see the other thing, so just return it back to its home. It's home up here. It's clear, so you can't see it. I know. It's invisible. Yeah, I've never liked that clear one. Even one of these days, I'm going to build another one, but it's on my project list of things to do. All right, so we are going to have, after today, the plan is to have 2 more weeks, and that is not a 2 more weeks that extends into 8 weeks. It's really going to try to be 2 weeks that we're going to try to finish up. That is it. Thank you, Michelle. I mean, it's okay. You can just...
It was in Caleb's office.
The youth minister. Yes. I'll find a way. You know, it's funny. They've been trying to play pranks on me for like 2 or 3 weeks, and every time it comes undone. Like they tried to roll my office when I was out of town, and the cleaning team cleaned it up before I was out there. They always try to pull pranks on me, and it always comes back on them. So the Lord's watching out for me. But so maybe this was one of them. Thank you, Michelle. I don't know where she is. Oh yeah, she's in that class, isn't she? Wait, do they use that for that class?
Yeah. But you can have it so we can sit in the
That's. You know, I didn't even think about that because they have a second class now.
The Lord has need of it.
Oh, they just sit down? Yeah.
If you have 2 lectures and somebody needs one.
That's right. I've got one to spare. 2 is one and 1 is none. You know? So, just in case this one crumbles. Yeah, I'm going to feel really bad if they were actually needing that. Whew. All right, let's get into our study this morning. We are looking in Ezekiel chapter 40. And for the curious from last week, I couldn't find that passage in Revelation about Gog and Magog. For some reason, I just could not see it. But for the curiosity, so I tell you that to say, last week and the week prior and the week before that, that's not the end of our discussion about Gog and Magog. Okay, when we get there in Revelation, we'll talk a lot more in depth about those occurrences because they relate to what's going on in Revelation. But that's just a side note. I just wanted to let you know. Now, in this range of Ezekiel 40 through 46, the main thing that we are looking at is that God is promising a new order for the future where his people will dwell with him, they'll worship him, it'll be a place of peace and worship, and as we'll see, even atonement for the people. Now, we're used to, at this point, going through the book of Ezekiel, these different visions that are given to Ezekiel. This one's unique in that Ezekiel is essentially carted away with a tour guide, if you will. Someone, this heavenly being, has taken him and showing him what this temple worship of the future is going to look like. And because we are doing such a broad range, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on each of these chapters. Mainly, what we're going to look at just preceding in chapter 39 to get some context. And we're mainly going to be looking at chapter 43, so that's where we're going to primarily be. But I came across a story about a man named John Griffith. He was a controller of a railroad back in the 1800s that went across this drawbridge across the Mississippi River. And one day he took his 8-year-old son, Greg, with him to work, and at noon Griffith put the drawbridge up to allow ships to pass and sat on the observation deck with his son to eat lunch. Time passed quickly, and suddenly he was startled. The early 1900s. I said the 1800s. And he sat on the observation deck with his son to eat lunch. As he was startled by the shrieking of a train whistle in the distance, he looked at his watch and noticed it was 1:07. The Memphis Express, with 400 passengers on board, was roaring toward the raised bridge. So this is a pretty precarious place to be. He leaped from the observation deck, ran back to the control tower. Just before throwing the master lever, he glanced down the check for any ships. He saw something that caused his heart to leap into his throat. Greg, his son, had slipped from the observation deck and had fallen into the massive gears that operated the bridge. His left leg was caught in the cogs of the two main gears. Desperately, John's mind whirled to devise a rescue plan. But as soon as he thought of a possibility, he knew there was no way it could be done. Again, the train whistle shrieked. He could hear the clicking of the wheels on the tracks. That his son was down there, yet there were 400 passengers on the train. John knew what he had to do. He buried his head in his left arm and pushed the master switch forward. The great massive bridge lowered into place just as the Memphis Express began to roar across the river. When Griffith lifted his head with his face smeared with tears, he looked into the passing windows of the train. There were businessmen casually reading their afternoon papers, finely dressed ladies in the dining cars sipping coffee, and children pushing long spoons into their dishes of ice cream. No one looked at the control house, and no one looked at the great gearbox. With wrenching agony, John Griffith cried out, "I sacrificed my son for you people, don't you care?" The train rushed by, but nobody heard the father's words. We think about the sacrifice that Jesus made of his own life. And Jesus being God, the second person of the Godhead, we think about the sacrifice that the Father made of the second person of God for the behalf of people. And this is really the story. I mean, it's tragic. I'll just be honest. I have a hard time reading those. I have a hard time just thinking about those. But those stories, those events that happen can sear into our hearts and our minds the immensity of the weight of what God does for us. Now, it's not a direct one-to-one parallel, because in this, he sort of sacrificed his son to save this whole train full of people. Jesus is not a son to God as Sailor is to me. Okay? He's not progeny. He's not offspring. But relationally, that's the relationship the second person of the Godhead has with the Father. So we can understand what that's like. Okay? And we're going to talk not about this story, but this concept in the message today when we look at the church at Ephesus in Revelation. And I just wonder how often we recognize the extent that God has went to purchase us from that enslavement of which we were in. As you mature as a believer, sin becomes exceedingly sinful. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you're an immature believer or a non-believer, there are certain aspects of life that you can say, well, yeah, that's really bad. But sometimes sin doesn't really appear that sinful to us, right? We just kind of pass it off. We play it off. It just doesn't seem like such a big deal, except for the things in our minds that do, right? We have those things that this category over here is the big things. And we should be abhorred about those. But these sins over here, well, those are the little things, and that shouldn't really be, what's a little lie? But as you mature as a believer, ideally we should be dying to that sin. And this isn't really about sin, it's about the glory of God, but we've got to talk about this a little bit to get there. You should be increasing in holiness. You should be, that sin, those things that tripped you up when you were younger should be diminishing in your life. But the sin that still keeps a hold will look more grotesque than it ever has. Does that make sense? So you could be the most pure in your life you've ever been and feel the weight of that sin heavier than it has ever been. Does that make sense? Because it's more exceedingly sinful to you, because you're growing in holiness. And so you're beginning to see the sin the way that God sees the sin. Okay. And if we begin to see the sin the way that God sees the sin, and we see how exceedingly sinful sin really is, then we begin to recognize how exceedingly good God truly is, and his sacrifice really is on our behalf. Okay. You look at a place like Revelation chapter 7, where Paul is going through that wretched man that I am, the thing I want to do, I don't do, and the thing I don't do, that's what I want to do. And so I find it a law that when I have the desire to do good, sin is still in me. It keeps me from doing the very things that I want to do. That is the sign of a mature faith, of seeing the exceeding sinfulness of sin. Okay? Yes, I think I saw a hand. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. And yeah, that's exactly, that's the other side coming at it. But yeah, both of these are two sides of the same coin. We see how incredibly good Jesus is, but we also see how incredibly sinful we are. And those two coming together promote a deeper affection and a deeper maturity, actually. We've been looking at here in Ezekiel, way back in chapter 36, how God changing the heart of Israel. Okay, through his grace. They had not had a national repentance that we are aware of. It's just God coming in his own divine initiative to say, I'm going to change their heart. I'm going to remove the heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. I'm going to place my spirit within them. I'm going to send them a Davidic king who's going to unite the kingdoms. And all of this restoration is all on God's behalf for his glory and our good, right? The exaltation of God's glory always results in the goodness for his people. And so at the end of chapter 39, it says, Therefore thus says the Lord God, Now I will restore the fortunes of Jacob and have mercy on the whole house of Israel, and I will be jealous for my holy name. They will forget their disgrace and all their treachery, which they perpetrated against me when they lived securely on their own land, with no one to make them afraid. When I bring them back from the peoples and gather them from the lands of their enemies, then I shall be sanctified through them in the sight of the many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God, because I made them go into exile among the nations, and then gathered them again to their own land. And I will leave none of them there any longer. I will not hide my face from them any longer, for I will have poured out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the Lord God. Okay. So, and this is where we ended last week, at the end of chapter 39. It makes you think of Jesus talking about leaving the 99 to follow the one. Did anyone get that? Because he's going to be their shepherd. They're his sheep. He said, not one of them will be left in exile. And when I read that, I just kept thinking about the good shepherd leaves the 99 to find the one that's gone astray. None of them will be left. All will be brought into his fold. All right, so then in chapter 40, we begin with a new vision, and it extends through chapter 42 of the temple construction. Ezekiel is given a tour of the outer and inner courts of the new temple. And again, there are a lot of details here. If you haven't read this already, I would encourage you to go back and read this. We'll read a sampling, okay? Not because it's unimportant, but because we're doing a survey and we need to get to really get to the point and focus, we need to get to chapter 43. But looking here in chapter 40, in the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the city was taken. So there's quite a bit of time that's passed in this letter. You remember when the city was taken, the person came and made that 6-month trek to report, Jerusalem has fallen. So this is 14 years past that. On that same day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me there. We've seen this over and over. What does it mean when Ezekiel says the hand of the Lord, or anywhere? I mean, it's all throughout the Old and New Testament alike. The hand of the Lord was upon him. What does that mean?
The Spirit.
Okay. The Spirit.
You're being guided and directed by God. This isn't just Ezekiel or whoever talking. I'm a mouthpiece for God.
Absolutely. Yeah. God's influence is heavy on me, and this message that I'm giving you, I've received directly. Because this was one of the critiques way back. Right? There are people who made prophecies of what they hoped would come to pass. And just self-serving.
Go with that. It's like I'm speaking with God's authority.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's like when our kids go to their brother or sister. Well, Mom said.
Yeah.
Unless it just carries a little bit more weight when it's God said.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and all throughout, I mean, this has been a repeating, this has been a refrain of his ministry, is when God's hand's upon him, the Spirit is with him, the Spirit is giving him this message, and it comes directly from God for the people. So let's look in verse 2 in the visions, and this time, just real quick, it brought me to this new reality. Now, if you remember early on in the book, one of these visions did the same thing. It took Ezekiel to the temple to see what was going on there. Does anyone, I know that's a long time ago, but does anyone remember what was going on in the temple? When God took him in this vision, in his mind's eye, if you will, to see all what's happening through the different parts of the temple, and he goes into the innermost holy of holies of the temple. Does anyone recall what was taking place there? Pagan worship. From pagans? From the priests themselves, right? From the leaders of Israel, there was worship happening in the Holy of Holies that wasn't directed toward Yahweh. It wasn't directed toward the Lord God. It was directed toward a whole host of deities. So here again, we have, okay, we've been told about a restoration. We see that God is changing their hearts. Then he's going to change their structure nationally. And he's going to change their ruler. And now he's going to do something else that's really important. He's going to change the heart of their worship. So whereas before, and you see, note the contrast here, whereas before he was taken to this vision and saw in the innermost courts this pagan worship by the leaders, now what does he see? Verse 2, in the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain. And on it to the south, there was a structure like a city. So he brought me there, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze, with a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand. He was standing in the gateway. The man said to me, Son of man, see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and give attention to all that I am going to show you. For you have been brought here in order to show it to you. Declare to the house of Israel all that you see. Where else have we heard this kind of language? Where have we seen this recently? Revelation. This is very parallel to what's going on in Revelation. Transporting you in this vision. God comes to meet him. I'm going to take you to see these things. I'm giving you these visions. Your job is to do what?
Pagan worship with priests.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to talk about a little bit of that today. But yeah, take this message back to the churches. Right to the churches. All that you see. All that has been, all that is, and all that will be. So it's the same thing. Same thing. And behold, there was a wall on the outside of the temple all around, and in the man's hand was a measuring rod of 6 cubits, each of which was a cubit and a handbreadth. All right. Cubit in biblical times, this is just trivia, was essentially from your middle finger to your elbow. Okay, that's approximately what a cubit would have been. Okay, a handbreadth or span is essentially, which mine would be bigger because I'm much bigger than an ancient Israelite would have been. Okay, average size then was average male was about 5'4". I'm 6'2", so it would have been much smaller than what I'm showing you right now. But a handbreadth was about the distance from your thumb to your pinky. Okay, so these were just units of measurement that, was literally at hand. Okay, you literally had a unit of measurement at hand. Your hand and your arm was the measurement. You didn't have to go searching for a tape measure where you laid it. Right, it's always there. So you're just given these measurements, and then it goes into a lot of details about the different aspects of the temple. Okay, and all these measurements, and it very much parallels what we see back in 2 Chronicles with when Solomon was building the temple, all the way back in Exodus when we're talking about the tabernacle. But we know that this isn't a reality then, because what happened during the Babylonian invasion? Because when they began in Ezra and Nehemiah, when they began to go back, right, from Babylon, Cyrus allows a return. It's not wholesale. Not everybody goes, but it's a limited return. What's one of the first orders of business? Rebuilding the temple. Right? Yeah, Nehemiah, they started on those foundations, right? Rebuilding the wall. So we know that this is not, he's having this vision. These are not things that are in existence at his time, because all of it has been destroyed. But what hope this would have inspired. What was the purpose of the temple in ancient Israelite? I say ancient Israelite. Now you're getting to the time when we can start calling them Jews. It's not accurate to call Abraham a Jew. He was a Hebrew. The Jewish religion was what formed during the Second Temple period. Okay, it's the same lineage, the same faith, but that's just not what they were called then. So, what do we know for the ancient Israelites and then the Jews that the purpose of the temple was? What are some things that we know? Okay, God resided there. The ark was there. What did the ark contain? Manna, Aaron's budding staff, and the Ten Commandments. When I was at Motlow, when I was a student at Motlow, we had to write a research paper. First research paper I'd ever had to write in college. And I wrote it over the Ark of the Covenant. My teacher allowed me to do that. That was cool. But so we have the ark that's in the Holy of Holies, that contains, or at least at one time it contained the budding staff of Aaron and the manna and the covenant tablets. What else? So God's presence was there. Okay, what does that mean? What does it mean God's presence was there? Yeah. Okay. So there were sections to it, right? And so you had the Holy of Holies, then you had the primary room, where like the bread of the table of presence was there, and you have like the menorahs there, and all of these things that are present there. Then you have the outer courts that only the priest could go, or those who were temple assistants could go there as well. Then you have the court of women, the court of men. That was for all men of Israel who could be there, bring their sacrifices. Then outside of that, you had the court of women. And then on the outside, you had the outer courts where anybody could frequent. So you had these different levels, but at the center of the structure is the Holy of Holies, and it's where God's presence would fill. And the priest could go there one time a year on the Day of Atonement to meet with the presence of God and make atonement for the nation of Israel. Okay, so what are some other things we know about the temple?
Priesthood.
What's that?
Priesthood. They would have every
Yeah, that's right. They could drag him out if he died when he went into the presence of the Lord. That's what I'm telling you guys. You know, we talk about like Jesus and it's all like warm and fuzzy and all. When you see people have encounters with God, like they didn't know if they were going to live through that. You know, I mean, what if every time you went to prayer, like you went? That's why I love the Lord's Prayer so much. Our Father who art in heaven. Right? There's intimacy and there's reverence. Like, we should come to God as we would to the most loving Father anyone could ever know. And yet we also come to the holy God who could melt you. Okay? What if you, every time you went into prayer, you thought about both of those things? It might change the way we prayed. So here they are. They go into the temple. So if this is the place where God comes to meet them, then this is a really special place. Right? This would be what we might call a liminal space. A place where heaven and earth would, you know, like a Venn diagram or something, like heaven and earth would come together and meet at the point of the temple in the Holy of Holies. Because that's where God's presence was. And humans could go in there just through the priest to meet with that God on behalf of humanity. Many believe that that's what Adam and Eve's role was in the garden. That the Garden of Eden was the Holy of Holies, and when they sinned, they brought something into that sacred sanctuary, and they were kicked out of it. So this was heaven on earth. This was the place where heaven came to meet humans on earth. Now let's look at chapter 43. Again, I would encourage you to go back and read these descriptions of the temple. They're charged with significance. They're charged with meaning. Just because we're skipping over them in all their detail doesn't mean they're not important at all. But in chapter 43, it says, "Then he led me to the gate facing toward the east, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east." And check this out. See if this is familiar to you. "And his voice was like the sound of many waters." Where do we hear that? Revelation last week, right? Just last week. I didn't plan it like that, so it worked out really well. So you know that in Ezekiel you're having an encounter with the glory of God. You know in Revelation when you hear the voice that sounds like many waters, you're having an encounter with the glory of God. Who is the one whose voice is like that in Revelation? Jesus. So when you read Revelation, you're reading what John says. He is exalting the full deity of Christ. There is no doubt. Are we aware that throughout church history, and even today, that there are groups that call themselves Christians who don't believe Jesus was God? Are we aware of that? Okay. Yeah, there are many. There are churches in this community who don't believe. There are multifaceted, that don't believe that Jesus was God. Okay. You can't read the Bible and get to that, so they make their own translations sometimes, or have some really strange hermeneutics. But when you see this here, they're having a vision of the glory of God. His voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when he came to destroy the city. Okay, again, the glory of God in this vision, which is beautiful to behold, is also the same type of vision that he had, the same vision of what he had when the city was destroyed. Powerful, not to be meddled with. And the visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Kabar, and I fell on my face. So we're connecting back with the very beginning of the book. Okay? And the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east. This comes up all over the place in the Old Testament, and I don't know the full significance of it. I think it'd be an interesting study. But when you look at, in the very beginning, when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, out, they went east of Eden. And when Cain and Abel had their episode, and Cain was kicked out of the land to go to the land of Nod, he went east of Eden. And all throughout, you see that this movement east is away from the presence of God. And here, you have the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east. He is unwinding the effects of their departure from his presence by even coming back from the same way. I just think it's fascinating. And the glory of the Lord, verse 5, and the Spirit, this is what Paul was talking about earlier, and the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. Then I heard one speaking to me from the house while a man was standing beside me. He said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among the sons of Israel forever. And the house of Israel will not again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their harlotry and by the corpses of their kings when they die, by setting their threshold by my threshold and their doorpost beside my doorpost, with only the wall between me and them. And they have defiled my holy name by their abominations which they have committed, so I have consumed them in my anger. Now let them put away their harlotry and the corpses of their kings far from me, and I will dwell among them forever. Okay. And then he tells them to describe this for the people, what he's seeing, the temple. You know. So what are some things that came to mind as you heard that, as you were reading? All we talked about with Ezekiel.
Verse 4.
Okay.
Verse 4 there. The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is the way, truth, and life. The gate. I'm the gate.
Mm-hmm.
Good shepherd. Through the gate. And I wonder.
Yeah, and they can only come in through him,
That's
right?
it.
Yeah.
The Lord entered through the gate.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus. Anyway, and I don't know, maybe this is wrong, but what I got there is through the gate facing east.
Yeah.
So if I'm facing east, I'm coming from the west.
Yeah.
So I don't know that.
Yeah.
That's, I don't know if that's right or not, because these words, like we talked about before, in the Greek, Hebrew, it's different. It's, when you translated it, and I don't know if those words are exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, I need to do a lot more study on that. It'd be an interesting thing to dive into. The Bible is full of details that are meant to communicate for us that we often just sort of, in our reading, just pass right over.
And then in the next sentence is the Spirit lifted.
Yeah.
And so that's in touch
Yeah.
with.
Yeah, in the Hebrew Bible, and I think I mentioned this last week, the Hebrew Bible is very much full of a bodily movement, right? Bodily functions, bodily movement, bodily symbolism. I mean, even in the New Testament, you talk about Jesus ascend to the right hand of the Father, right? When they were worshiping, they would fall down on their faces. You know, when they prayed, they lifted their hands up. I mean, it's very different than we are. Okay, just very different than we are. We're certainly more reserved in that way. But the Hebrew Bible isn't, for sure. And the New Testament really isn't either. What else? What are some things that you gathered from this reading?
I find it interesting in verses 6 and 7, where it says, "This is my throne.
Yeah.
This is where my feet are.
Yeah, the soles of my feet are here. Yeah.
I will dwell in the house of Israel, but you're not going to defile me anymore."
Absolutely.
And I would imagine that even in that presence of raised hands and the bowing down, there was a defilement. And for him to lay claim that I am here, and that's no longer going to happen. You cannot be here and that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this is what God had always been working toward with his people, right? When they were in their long stay, which became an enslavement in Egypt, right? And they were delivered from that. God was trying to bring them back to the land he had promised them through Abraham. but it was occupied with foreign nations who were filled with pagan practices. So all those battles and things were meant to try to clear the land so that the people could be where they were always rightfully to possess, and God would be with them, and God would be their God, and they would be his people, and there would be this intimacy.
And this isn't just a verse relevant for Ezekiel.
Yeah.
I know we've had conversations, and I remember Janice mentioning about, we do not call this a sanctuary.
Sanctuary, yeah.
Okay? But when the Word of God, that's God's throne, and God's feet are here, I think we have to practice that. I'm not coming to the sanctuary to defile God.
Yeah.
And that defilement comes in, my body is here, but my heart and mind is not.
Yeah.
That defilement comes when I'll do whatever I want the other days of the week, but I'm going here because it makes me feel good or I'm supposed to.
Yeah.
So I think he's speaking to our generation too, that God is present and our defilement does not need to be present.
Right. Yeah, and that's what Jesus explained this further in John 4 when he's talking to the woman at the well, that, do we worship God at the temple? You Jews think that you worship God at the temple in Jerusalem, and we think Mount Gerizim, however you pronounce that, I think that's the way it's pronounced. And Jesus says, what? Right, that's right. So the place of the Spirit's occupation is the place at which worship is to be offered. And the Spirit's occupation upon the work of Jesus and his atoning work on the cross on behalf of humanity, and that new humanity that has stepped into the cloak of that atoning work have received the Spirit, and we call that the church.
Not by might, not by power,
That's right.
but by my Spirit,
Yeah.
saith the Lord. And it's not by our hands, it's nothing we make, nothing we can do. It's
Yeah.
Spirit and
Yeah.
power.
Spirit and truth.
No one can know what that is.
Yeah, and I think getting to that, like, there's no pretenses. There's just honesty when you come before God. I'll be honest with you. Most Sundays, not most Sundays, most every single day, like, my prayer is help. I don't know about you, but most days, that's my prayer. God, I just need your help. I can't do this. I do not have the power or ability to do what I feel like you're calling me to do. So I need your help to do it. I need your forgiveness and your grace to empower me to do that work. So it's just interesting because all of this still ties in with the Spirit's work in the New Testament as we've been looking at those connections. But you're right. Yeah, go ahead.
May I give a kind of an analogy about all that you just said?
Sure.
Yesterday morning, I woke up with a person's life name on my mind. Something that I had done concerning this person years before. And I tried to find where this person was so that I could go and share what I had done previously in the years past. And I wasn't able to find it. But because of that scripture that Jesus is asked, knock, seek, then I kept trying to find it. So I did. So now I have what I need to go because I believe that because the Spirit dwells in me, because I am in my life, God is paramount, that I will finish what He put in my head, in my whatever it was when I awakened this renewal. So for our ministry, servitude, reverence to God in the way that we are the body. That kind of made sense to me.
Yeah.
I knew what he was doing, but when you said that, it was like all of us, because we're all of us, or we're some of us. He is,
Yeah.
and we do things when the Spirit moves us up, and takes us somewhere.
Mhm.
That's our gift,
Yeah.
ministry.
Yeah, and that's why Paul calls it the fruit. Those things manifest in our life, the fruits of the Spirit, right? These are the fruit-bearing qualities that come when the Spirit occupies your life. And so thank you for that, Ms. Marcia. We'll touch on this briefly again next Sunday and move into the next range. I realize I abandoned my PowerPoint, but that's where we got to. But thank you all for being in class today. We are dismissed.